In this segment, recorded on June 29, 2012, join me for a conversation with a frequent guest of the show, David Morgan, the Silver Guru, an expert on money, metals, and mining, also a lecturer and an author. Mr. Morgan has written Get the Skinny on Silver Investing, available on Amazon.com. His website is themorganreport.com. Today he brings an esteemed colleague of his to the show, Paul Mladjenovic. Mr. Mladjenovic is a certified financial planner, writer, speaker, and author of Stock Investing for Dummies, as well as other books. His website is ravingcapitalist.com. He hosts business and financial seminars as well as tutorials that you can find linked on the website. Paul and David, thanks for joining me today on the program.
My pleasure, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
David, you called me yesterday and had mentioned that you had a conversation with Paul that was worth taking to our audience. Do you want to begin?
I do. I'm going to give some background on Paul. And he's responsible for writing Precious Metals Investing for Dummies, a couple more along those lines. He's well regarded as an author. He's also, I think, and more importantly, seen firsthand what goes on in a socialistic government. And because of that, he basically moved to the United States, and I, again, learned about Paul and his story very early on. And as things have progressed down the quote-unquote progressive path, meaning more and more toward a socialistic environment, Paul has become more and more upset, and this ObamaCare thing was sort of a straw that broke the camel's back. And of course, I'm speaking for Paul, and he could correct me on this. But he was pretty taken back by it because he's seen what's taking place here in the United States. I thought, you know what, people need to hear the real facts, because there's a lot of people in the precious metals community that really don't understand what's really going on and what does take place. So I will get off my long intro to Paul, turn it over, and let me know if I misquoted anything, and let us know what got you so upset about the Obamacare situation.
First of all, thank you kindly. I think you did a great job. I really appreciate it, and I'm grateful for being on your program, Ellis. Thank you kindly for this wonderful platform. For me, the bottom line is, look, I came from a communist country, so I'm very familiar with socialism. Above and beyond leaving it and being a student of it all my life, I'm now 53, so I count for a lot for what I'm talking about. And I've come to learn about how statism, in my case, it was the extreme form, communism, and the idea about socialistic practices, how it runs industries. I've come to learn that a lot of this is what ends up destroying prosperity. My experience back then helped me to understand how policies work, both for the good and for the bad. As David knows, I do a lot of stuff on the internet where I've given my projections, and for the most part, a lot of easy predictions that I thought they came true when I got my clients out of the housing market, because I saw that government, statism, injected itself, and it made at first boom, but ultimately collapse. Yesterday, I found it to be a very frightening event, with Obamacare being upheld by the Supreme Court, because never mind if you're conservative or liberal, never mind about what your political view is about this, and you heard a lot of pundits yesterday, both pro and con, and a lot that don't know. The bottom line is that when you have this kind of invasive statism, you're going to cause much more trouble than you're going to really cure. And let's face it, in Yugoslavia, every communist country I ever knew always promised you free health care, basically. But free doesn't mean you get your hands on it. It means you don't pay for it, but it also means you don't get it. And the thing is, when I hear people talking about Obamacare, the one thing they keep on misunderstanding about this is that, look, healthcare is an economic good. It's like a commodity. So basically, it's subject to supply and demand. And when you put government into the mix, you basically warp and imbalance supply and demand, where the end result is you have catastrophe. We're all familiar with Greece and so many other venues out there where they're collapsing. People forget it's because all of this is an extreme form of statism. Big government is not an engine of production, it's an engine of consumption. But the bottom line is, to me, yesterday I saw it as a frightening extension of statism, which would ruin supply and demand, which basically, if this thing is not changed or modified or repealed, what we witnessed yesterday was putting healthcare on the long, declining path toward destruction.
Essentially, the U.S. government has taken over the auto industry, banking, and now the healthcare system. What's left?
You find out that the last vestiges of individual liberty are remaining. I'm an entrepreneur, and I know Dave is also self-employed as well, and we basically work hard to do what? Produce and make more of the fruits of our labor available to ourselves and our families while we're serving customers. And as government keeps on growing, it starts to crowd out the very things that we do. And the thing is that in government, it has to rely on a healthy economy if it's going to succeed. So in many respects, government, from a functional sense, and I hate to put it this way, but from a functional sense, government is like a cancer on a good body. If the body is healthy, everybody will survive, even the cancer. But if the cancer overpowers the body that it's living on, then the body dies and the cancer itself dies. That's like a stark example, I realize that. The point is that if government grows too big, it's not only bad for the economy, but it's bad for government, and it's also bad for the people who are dependent on government. This is an important point.
There is a government in power that the people elected. The people made a choice, and these are the consequences of that choice.
Well, at the very least, I always tell people that I wish that the debate would one day get to the point where people are arguing between small government or smaller government. And I think in the last 50 years, the political parties, the debate was, do you choose between big government and bigger government? But we've crossed the line where now the debts are too heavy to sustain. Government is even collapsing of its own weight. Look at the recent news. Stockton, California is filed for bankruptcy because it grew beyond its ability to take care of itself, and the taxpayers in that town can't bear the weight anymore. So you're going to see a lot of examples of this where you cannot sustain this stuff anymore. Consumption can't be sustained without production, and production is being harmed because they raise taxes and put more restrictions on those things that are necessary in the economy to keep going so you can pay for all of this. This is an important point, and we're crossing into the line. We're not talking now about a possible double-digit recession. I think since 2008, we've been in a single-dip depression. People will pay for it dearly because of all the political functions and malfunctions that have been going on since 2008 and beyond.
David, any comments, questions?
First of all, on the comment side, when I was in Beijing, China, and met with the Mining Bureau, they were, of course, very much under a socialistic situation. And what I found fascinating was how fair it was, because, you know, the idea or the ideal being that, you know, everyone wants fairness, you know, equality, everyone's equal. And, of course, those words sound good. In fact, they sound very similar to the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. But coming back to the point, the Mining Bureau, in the old days, what they would do is they had a set amount of money that was dictated by government, and they took that amount and they divided it by the number of mining projects that existed. So for a quick example, let's just say that there was $1,000 in 10 mining projects, so everyone got $100. It's the idea I want to make clear, so the numbers are immaterials just to give you the idea. But everyone got the equal amount of money. That sounds fair, doesn't it? But think it through. What this means is that mining projects that had absolutely no merit whatsoever of ever becoming economic, producing a profit, getting metal or potash or whatever it was out of the ground at an economic value, got the same amount of money that a project that had true merit of real size and economic viability received. And the money was so small that no one could really do anything. So everyone got equally treated, fair, but nothing got produced. Now let's go to the free market model. The free market model, you go out and you discover something. The market decides whether it's economic or not. And in most cases, the market gets it right. And so the person or people that find and develop a mining project that's profitable get rewarded, and people share in those profits. And the projects that fail. And that's what it's all about. And that's actually the way that the quote-unquote communist situation is today. It's changed radically from the way it used to be. So this idea of fairness and everyone getting the same thing is ridiculous when you look at it from the way the world really works. The way the world really works is that you have to go out, you have to, in the mining instance, you have to go out, find it, produce it, make a profit on it, and those that invest share in the profit. So that's one example. So that's one I wanted to comment on because, Paul, I know that we think a lot alike. So with the follow-up question, I like to backtrack and go back into your past and explain what it was like growing up under communism and what you saw, how vibrant or non-vibrant was it, what kind of black market were there, what did your parents worry about, what were your concerns, and what were your thoughts about why you wanted to get out of there and get to the United States?
I was a young boy at the time. My parents, who had to do the most suffering, and they did whatever they could to get out. And we ended up leaving in 1963. And ironically, part of the impetus was that I was very ill at the time, too. And the interesting thing is that all the free health care in Yugoslavia was not able to help me. So fortunately, doctors and, this wretched capitalist system saved me when I got over here. So, it's really quite interesting because people have to understand about the difference there. I mean, in Yugoslavia, according to law, everybody got basically equal access to health care and provided. Everybody was guaranteed this and guaranteed that. It only worked in someone's imagination because in reality, all communism, which is just an extreme, hardcore version of socialism, all this stuff really produces at the tail end is poverty and oppression. Like right now, we're watching Europe, and it's amazing how many examples you see about this. I mean, my country was Yugoslavia. My country collapsed into oblivion in 1994, and fortunately, I was able to watch safely from a distance in America, watching it go on, even though I still had family, like in Belgrade, etc. And the thing is that communism only produces poverty and oppression. And they wanted to do their own version of stimulus in 1993 when they tried to print up, literally millions of dinar, the then Yugoslavian currency, and all it really produced was a hyperinflation. So even though there was a wretched poverty and grinding conditions throughout, all the money you produced at the time, whatever they did, for the printing press, the actual printing press versus today when we use, a few clicks of the mouse stroke. And the thing is, all that money, what did it produce? It didn't produce prosperity, it just produced inflationary prices. So now people not only couldn't eat what they wanted, they couldn't even afford at that point. So economic disintegration then led into social disintegration, which became civil war, and it collapsed. And the thing is, the same recipe is being played out elsewhere. Look at Greece. Look at these other ones. When you have communism and government running things, and you don't allow supply and demand and the free interplay of the marketplace, be able to allocate resources properly, you get to a point where you have breakdown, chaos, and ultimately collapse until the slate is cleared. History keeps on repeating. This is nothing new that's going on right now. And what are we doing in America? Trillions of new debt, more restraints on production, trying to reward people more on the consumption side. You're slowly grinding in the same direction, and it's not going to look good at the tail end of this.
Are we seeing economic civil war happening in the West?
Well, when you say economic civil war, presuming what? Who is jockeying for more resources for their country?
Are we seeing class warfare in government?
You're already seeing it to a great extent. I was watching Greece to whatever extent I could. Now those people are fighting for things, everything from food supplies to medical supplies. And the breakdown is just spectacular, and thank God we're watching from a distance. But it's going to happen across the board. Those governments, the only thing they seem to be able to produce is more debt and more currency. But the thing is, you cannot automatically press a few clicks and all of a sudden make more natural resources and more material goods more abundant. There is a breakdown, and you're going to see more conflict over natural resources without a doubt, even among countries that used to be before allies. Because the European Union is really just an artificial configuration where you're shoving countries together who are really very distinct and different. So you're going to see more friction and more conflict without a doubt, unfortunately.
Now, your website is called ravingcapitalist.com, and David alluded to China earlier. Do we have capitalism in China that is in fact successful?
Well, the thing is, they're allowing capitalism to a great extent, and to a different extent to what we do here in America. I mean, over there, the government is still, by and large, communist, but they have been, for the most part, keeping their hands off the systems over there. But I also think that it's creating a lot of abuse as well. I have boys, and they're still at a level where they enjoy a toy or two. And I think a lot of what they're doing over there is stuff that I don't agree with. They create toys that are very toxic in nature. In their drive to become producers and controllers of resources, this is going to be causing a lot of backlash as well. I think there'll be great problems with China in the next few years, especially since they're developing a military. So I think it's going to be a very difficult realm. And for me, when I call myself a raving capitalist, I mean, I try to tell people the difference between capitalism and socialism. And capitalism is about mutual voluntary exchange. Typically, you go to a store and buy stuff, so there's mutual exchange, so there's social cooperation involved. Who could be against that? I became a raving capitalist because I saw the real side of socialism and communism. All of these things are based on coercion, control, and confiscation. It's not based on a mutual exchange. It's basically about thievery, control, etc. So it's not a place that's going to grow and become more prosperous. It's just going to end up in where all things result. When you're talking about Athens, same policies beget decline and collapse. So watch out for that.
Speaking of coercion, confiscation, and taxation, Obamacare is supposedly going to be enforced through the IRS. I had a friend text me yesterday complaining she was going to have trouble paying for mandatory health care. Is this coercion here?
Oh, without a doubt. What is a tax? A tax is not mutual exchange. It's not like if the IRS sends you a marketing letter and you say, nah, I think I'll ignore it. You know, you better respond and ante up on whatever the amount is. Otherwise, coercion means things such as closing down your business or things that are far worse in nature. You can easily label Obamacare as probably the largest tax increase in the history of the world at this point. When you look at the numbers, you're talking about $500 billion in taxes. And that's not the total. That's the first major bill. When the first full year hits, $500 billion. And then it's going to get even worse down the road. So whatever people think they're going to get from Obamacare, I think they're going to be in for a rude awakening, because if you're going to harm the economy with taxation, that means the economy cannot be able to keep affording the other things that it'll need, among them health care. So it's going to cause a tremendous breakdown in health care specifically, but a great breakdown in the economy in general.
David, do you think Obamacare's ratification now by the Supreme Court and this perceived economic hit is a factor in the rally we're seeing in today's gold price?
It could be a factor. In fact, I think it probably is. I think more importantly for today, as we're doing this interview, it's probably the fact that the Eurozone continues to waddle around and not come to any really meaningful conclusion on how they're going to deal with these debt burdens. And there is no way out at this point. I mean, it's mathematically impossible to get out of the debt situation in Europe. It's mathematically impossible to get out of the debt situation in the United States. I think most people miss, because they don't really understand how government functions, is that the government doesn't really provide anything. They'll, of course, argue with hearing that and say, well, wait a minute, if government's going to provide this health care for everyone. But by providing that, it's not the government that's providing it, it's actually the citizenry that's providing it. So the government is actually a huge transfer agent. They're taking money from the producers and they're giving it to everybody, quote unquote, equally. Well, how is it fair or equal when a lot of the population doesn't work at all, or they're dependent on government and government alone to be able to eat and live, etc.? This dependency or entitlement idea that started primarily under the Johnson administration, noted as guns and butter, where we could have war and hand out huge social welfare programs, doesn't work. It doesn't work. It might work in the short run, but it doesn't work in the long run. And now we're at the long run. We hit the long run quite some time ago in reality, meaning that if every American ponied up their quote-unquote fair share, it's impossible. There's not enough of a monetary base. If everyone sent in all their assets, money-wise, to Washington, D.C., you still couldn't dent the deficit. And so when you get this free stuff, it's being paid for. It's being paid for by you for the most part. And that's what people don't understand. They think that they're getting something for nothing. No, there's a huge price to pay. And the ultimate price has been shown throughout history again and again and again, and that is you get a deterioration in the moral structure of the society, you get a deterioration in the living standard of the society, and you also get a deterioration in the educational base. So all things that make an economy strong and healthy go away, and all things that are cited to decline are what happens in a socialistic environment. In fact, if you look back at the Roman Empire, there's lots of causes of why that happened. I'd argue it was primarily the monetary case that caused a lot of the other problems to manifest. But at the very end, everyone was wanting to become a Roman citizen. Why? Because they got something for nothing. That was the perception. They got free bread and circuses. The government knew that in order to keep the society going a little longer than perhaps it could have, otherwise they had to provide some kind of entertainment, which was, of course, the gladiator shows, everything that went on in the Colosseum, and provide this free bread. And that kept the populace distracted from the fact that the monetary base had been debased to such a level that basically the money was becoming more and more worthless all the time, to what ultimately became worthless altogether. And this, again, is kind of a metaphor for what's going on in the United States with all that goes on to distract us, and the mainstream media really not doing a fair or honest job of telling the people the truth.
What's the real return on investment for this taxation, Paul?
You're going to dispense services in some way, but I think the point that I love to tell people, and I try to make it as simple so that even a college professor can understand. Look, every successful economy has to have a balance of consumption and production. In other words, a good, successful economy goes forward with supply and demand. You know, and that's engendered in what? Consumption and production. for all the consumption that you want, whatever we want, whether it's food or whatever, whether it's bread or circuses or anything else for that matter, or healthcare, you need production as well. And the thing is, an economy can tolerate a certain amount of public assistance. Public at large has no problem paying taxes to help dispense things such as, mechanism to survive and even survive comfortably for lots of people. I mean, the poor in America are actually, quote-unquote, richer than the poor in most places of the world. So in terms of dispensing services, we do that. But you're getting to the point now where consumption and production has been highly impaired. When the government spends beyond its means, what you're talking about is government is an engine of consumption. So what happens here is you have more and more people who consume, more and more people who are dependent, but you have now a breakdown where there's less and less people being able to produce and to provide. And this is at the heart of the problem right now. A lot of businesses are closing shop. I saw a recent statistic that said 23% of most small businesses, the owners can't even pay themselves. And on the flip side, you now have it where you have record numbers of people who are unemployed, record numbers of people who are on public assistance, record number of people who are getting food stamps. And again, we don't begrudge people the ability to survive. We want to be able to do that. But at some point, consumption cannot be met with shrinking production. Government is not an engine of production. It's an engine of consumption. So the thing is, you have to now, at the point, the government is bigger than it's ever been at all levels. You have to burden that. You have to carry that on top of public assistance. So it's getting untenable and unsustainable. So yes, we want to provide services to the neediest among us. And we were able to do that before, but now you can't because government is growing too large, huge bureaucracies, and they're getting in the way of themselves. I think it's dreadful. In the next few years, you're going to have to do austerity, and it's not a choice. It's either austerity or collapse. Those are your choices if we want to continue to sustain and provide what people need to even get by. So this is a huge problem, and ObamaCare only compounds this problem. It doesn't alleviate it.
We're headed for a collapse if we're not in it already, let's say. How did Eastern Europe turn itself around after its collapse and after the wall came down? How are we going to do it?
Well, here's the thing. Keep in mind that there's basically two types of collapses to be potentially aware of. I have my YouTube channel. People can easily find it, Paul Mlad, and I did a two-part series on economic collapse and what you would do. First of all, the most common collapse in world history, in terms of the economy, has been a currency collapse. In other words, you print a currency into oblivion, heads into hyperinflation, and to the point where it's worthless. If you keep on overproducing it, then each successive unit becomes less valuable. And this is what happens in inflation. And inflation is not when goods and services increase in price. It's when the value of money comes down because of overproduction. So currency collapses, you can't number how often it's happened. And you have historic conditions now where many, if not most, of the world's major currencies are being overproduced at a rapid clip, certainly when you compare it versus what it was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. So you might have the situation that a new currency regime has to be put in place, but the economy can stay intact except for some disruption. But an economic collapse becomes even worse because you're talking about destroying production, which what occurs, and you have many people then at that point hungry and dependent, and you can't fend for them, then chaos comes. So I think in some parts of the country, you're going to have economic collapse. I think in some parts of California, right now, it's baked into the cake. Which one occurs? That's what we'll have to see in the next few years if we're able to pull back the horns and make things this easier to mitigate.
David, a question for Paul?
The last question I like to ask him is, how good is it now relative to when you guys left? I mean, you still have family there, aunts, uncles, etc. How much better is it now than it was, let's say, when you were a child and you left Yugoslavia?
Well, here's the thing. Yugoslavia was a coercive configuration of some nation-states like Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia, etc. And the thing is, whether you clear all the imbalances and the overburdens through nonviolent means or through violent means, the slate does end up getting clean one way or the other. It could be very painful, or you could minimize the pain. And after everything settled down and the individual states came into play, the bottom line is it's better now than it certainly was back then, if you're talking about my old country or my old ex-country, because I was actually born in Croatia, which was, of course, part of Yugoslavia back then. Since that occurred and a few years of disruption and stabilization, a lot of the smaller entities cropped up and became independent. They were smaller countries, more self-sufficient, and they didn't have to deal with the burden of huge communist bureaucracies which were stepping on them. And plus, because you had the chance to do profits, look, in a successful economy, you need profit. That's what helps the economy get back on its feet. So they became, a little bit more free market in its orientation, which I think is great. And a lot of other countries as well, like Estonia, etc. For us, if we navigate our way through this, you're going to have in America lots of disruptions, upheaval, and I think hyperinflation is definitely a strong possibility in the next few years. But it's going to depend how we're going to navigate it. You're going to have some pockets of America having extreme problems and chaos and unrest, without a doubt. I think some parts of America, you can't avoid it because of what's baked into the cake right now. But I think on the other side of it, with a new regime, hopefully a currency that's tied to a limiting factor, such as gold or some standard thereof, it doesn't have to be gold, but some standard, then we could be on the other side of it and start to heal a few years afterwards it occurs. We still don't know how it's going to play out with the November elections in the next few years. I'm monitoring it very, very closely as I can.
Well, we're competing with our benefactors in China as far as production and consumption are concerned in the United States. We're not really producing what we're consuming. Did we see a dramatic upswing in production and manufacturing in Eastern Europe as part of the success of those particular economies?
I think a good example is East Germany. After it took off the shackles and then helped to basically blend into West Germany and pick up the abilities to grow and produce from West Germany. Their recovery came pretty quickly, actually. Within probably like 2 years. That was actually a fairly successful, all things being equal, it was a fairly successful rebound for them. And I think that it could very easily happen on our end as well. I'm not as hopeful about some parts of the world out there. I think there'll be problems in places ranging from Venezuela to some parts of Russia. And I think you're going to see some real problems continue with some of the countries that are like Spain, Italy, and France. France just became socialist. I think they're going to have some horrendous problems the next few years. And I think that's baked into the cake because of the elections.
Paul, what was the take with precious metals during the collapse in that area?
In Yugoslavia?
Yes.
Well, the thing about that is that many people couldn't get their hands on precious metals because the government had strict controls on it. It reminds me of Zimbabwe, if you recall. People in that country, they were forced to partake of their currency, and they were not allowed to access things that could be a store of value. If you had any precious metals, you had better not tell the government or any of the lawless bands that were like in its wake during social unrest. I'm hopeful now with it being more of a worldwide market, that will be more of a positive influence for precious metals so people can have a store of value when their currencies are going to be, heading into difficulty. So we'll wait and see on that as well, my friend.
Well, gentlemen, it's been a great discussion today. Thank you both for joining me on the program.
Thank you, Ellis. I appreciate your program, and God bless all of you.
Thank you, Ellis. Appreciate you taking the time to give us this opportunity to interview on your show.
I've been speaking with money, metals, and mining expert David Morgan. His website is themorganreport.com. Also joining us today was author and certified financial planner Paul Mladjenovic. Find Paul at ravingcapitalist.com. Listen to this segment again on the podcast page of our website, ellismartinreport.com.